March 13, 2006. Red and blue lights flood a quiet street as SWAT teams surround a bank. A helicopter circles overhead, rotors chopping the air. Tactical units stack at the entrance. Rifles raised. Breach tools ready. Police commanders are certain the suspect is inside. They've sealed the perimeter. They've cut off the exits. They believe the thief is trapped. 60 meters away, none of that matters. Inside a parked minivan, a man sits calmly, finishing a sandwich. No mask. No rush. No visible stress. He's wearing a headset. Not for music. Not for a phone call. The headset is tuned directly into the police tactical frequency. Every command. Every unit position. Every planned movement. It all flows straight into his ear. Prepare to breach. The man hears the order in real time. He wipes his hands, turns the key, and pulls away from the curb. By the time SWAT storms the building, the vault is empty. No suspect. No trail. The man is gone. This wasn't luck. He'd been listening to them for months. He knew their response times down to the second. He knew how long it took the first cruiser to arrive, and the second, and the third. Police didn't chase him. They arrived to protect a crime scene that had already been cleared. And this was just one job. The same man had robbed banks across multiple countries. He had escaped police custody as a teenager, through a ceiling. And years earlier, he had parachuted onto an imperial palace to steal a crown jewel without triggering a single alarm. To investigators, he seemed untouchable. A ghost who could hear them coming before they even knew they were moving. But here's the twist. The man who defeated every alarm, every camera, and every police tactic didn't get caught by a brilliant counter-move. He got caught because of the simplest mistake imaginable. So how did one thief turn police radios into weapons? How did he outthink institutions designed to stop people exactly like him? And what careless error finally exposed the man who always seemed one step ahead? To understand how this happened, you have to go back. Long before the scanners. Before the banks. Before the palace roof. You have to understand how he learned to see the world as a system. Long before police radios and bank vaults entered the picture, Gerald Blanchard was just a quiet kid in Winnipeg with an unusual obsession. While other children spent their afternoons playing street hockey, Gerald sat at the kitchen table with a Phillips head screwdriver, taking things apart. Alarm clocks. Radios. Anything with moving parts. He didn't break them for fun. He dismantled them to understand how they worked. He mapped the gear trains inside alarm clocks. He traced circuit paths inside the family VCR until he figured out how to bypass its regional lock, letting it record channels it wasn't supposed to receive. Under his bed, his mother found stacks of disassembled radios. To Gerald, every device was a locked door, and he wanted the key to all of them. When he was 12, his family relocated to a small town outside Omaha, Nebraska, following his stepfather's job. The move was supposed to be a fresh start. Instead, it delivered a lesson Gerald would never forget. Within months, a local bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on their home over a $2,000 shortfall. Gerald watched as his mother sat at the kitchen table and cried. Across from her were men in suits, calmly quoting statutes and deadlines. There was no negotiation. No flexibility. Just process. The sheriff eventually arrived to post the foreclosure notice on the front door. To Gerald, the message was clear. Institutions hold power. And that power doesn't come from strength or morality. It comes from rules. Rules written by people. Rules enforced by systems. And as Gerald was beginning to understand, systems follow logic. Logic can be mapped. Logic can be tested. And once you understand the code, the outcome becomes predictable. That realization didn't make him angry. It made him curious. if power followed rules, and rules were just another kind of code, then in theory, any system could be decoded. That idea would quietly sit in the back of Gerald Blanchard's mind, waiting for the moment it would be tested in the real world. By the time Gerald Blanchard reached his mid-teens, curiosity had started to turn into experimentation. He wasn't interested in chaos or thrill-seeking. He was interested in proof. Proof that systems didn't just exist, they could be exploited. At 15, Gerald began targeting big-box electronics stores. Walkman players. Cordless phones. He shoplifted the items quietly, without confrontation, then moved to the second phase of the test. Using his school's photocopier, he forged return receipts. Clean. Believable. Ordinary. He would walk back into the store, merchandise in hand, receipt attached, posture relaxed. And the system worked exactly as designed. Cash refunds were issued for items he had never paid for. No alarms sounded. No employees questioned him. Loss prevention systems weren't built to detect confidence paired with paperwork. They were built on assumptions. That a teenage boy with a receipt wasn't a thief. Gerald identified the assumption and walked straight through it. The money added up faster than anyone realized. By 16, Gerald pooled his illicit earnings and bought a house outright. In cash. No bank loan. No credit history. While classmates worried about driver's permits and part-time jobs, a real estate agent handed him keys without asking how a teenager could afford the purchase. The system didn't care where the money came from. It only cared that the transaction fit the rules. Each success reinforced the same lesson. Institutions weren't watching for intelligence. They were watching for deviation. And as long as Gerald stayed within expected patterns, he could move freely. But his next test would push those assumptions further than ever before, and bring him face to face with law enforcement for the first time. One frigid night in rural Nebraska, Gerald Blanchard agreed to help another teenager commit what seemed, at first, like a simple insurance scam. The plan was straightforward. Torch an old car. Collect the payout. In a cornfield outside town, Gerald and an accomplice doused a rusted Pontiac in gasoline, far too much gasoline, and struck a match. The explosion lit up the horizon. A fireball bloomed into the night sky. Black smoke spiraled upward like a signal flare. Sirens followed almost immediately. As patrol cars approached, Gerald's accomplice panicked and bolted for the tree line. Gerald did the opposite. He walked calmly toward the incoming cruisers, hands visible, rehearsing the role of a concerned bystander. The act didn't last long. Officers smelled accelerant on his jacket before he finished his first sentence. Handcuffs clicked shut. A squad car carried him to the Sarpy County Sheriff's Station. Inside the interrogation room, deputies made a simple assumption. A 16-year-old in a small Nebraska town wasn't a flight risk. They left Gerald unshackled, alone, unwatched. While deputies stepped out to confer with the duty sergeant, Gerald studied the room. Cinder block walls. A metal table bolted to the floor. A two-way mirror. And above it all, a drop ceiling. Standard acoustic tiles. A 2x4 aluminum grid. Roughly 18 inches of crawl space. Gerald climbed onto the table, pushed a ceiling tile aside, and pulled himself into the darkness. Cold ductwork pressed against his ribs as he army-crawled through the ceiling void. Below him, a door opened. A deputy shouted his name. Gerald didn't stop. He reached a junction above what sounded like a storage room, punched through another tile, and dropped onto a shelf stacked with file boxes. From there, he slipped out a rear fire exit and into the night. In the gravel lot behind the station, his friend sat waiting in an idling Buick, ears glued to a Radio Shack police scanner. Through the static came frantic radio chatter. Suspect in the vents. Locked down the building. Headlights flared. Doors slammed. Gerald sprinted across frozen gravel, yanked open the passenger door, and dove inside. As the Buick peeled onto the county road, Gerald clutched 2 souvenirs grabbed from an unattended desk near the exit. A deputy's badge. And a Motorola police radio. Trophies from his first successful escape. That night didn't just free Gerald Blanchard. It rewired something fundamental in his mind. Every system he had faced had failed for the same reason. People made assumptions. Assumptions created gaps. And gaps could be exploited. The sheriff's department assumed a teenager wouldn't check the ceiling. Assumed a suspect wouldn't walk toward police. Assumed their radio frequency was secure. For Gerald, those assumptions weren't protections. They were invitations. And the feeling of slipping through them, of outthinking authority, wasn't just satisfying. It was electric. After the escape, Gerald Blanchard stopped seeing crimes as isolated acts. He began seeing patterns. Every lock, every alarm, every procedure he had encountered shared the same flaw. They were designed by people. And people design systems around expectations. What a suspect will do. What a criminal won't attempt. What officers assume is secure. To Gerald, those assumptions were no longer invisible. They were measurable. The sheriff's department hadn't failed because of weak equipment. They failed because they trusted behavior models that didn't include someone like him. A teenager who checked the ceiling. A suspect who walked toward police instead of away. Someone who listened instead of ran. By his mid-20s, back in Winnipeg, Gerald had refined these observations into a working doctrine. A bank, he concluded, wasn't a fortress. It was a system. Vaults followed time lock schedules. Alarms followed circuit logic. Cameras followed fixed angles with predictable blind spots. Most criminals focused on beating the hardware. Gerald focused on the only variable that mattered. The human response. Guards. Managers. And above all, police. They controlled the timing. And timing controlled everything. If you could predict when officers would arrive, you didn't need to rush. You didn't need to fight. You didn't even need to flee. You just needed to operate inside the window. Gerald called the idea a reverse stakeout. Instead of casing a target and escaping when things went loud, he flipped the sequence. He would enter weeks before the job. Plant surveillance devices. Tap into police frequencies. Trigger test alarms. Then he would measure. 6 minutes. 7 minutes. 8 minutes. On the night of the real job, he wouldn't race against the police. He would schedule them. He would work calmly, knowing exactly when the first cruiser's tires would squeal into the lot. By the time officers arrived, there would be nothing left to chase. They wouldn't pursue a suspect. They would secure an empty crime scene. It sounded like something out of a movie. But Gerald Blanchard wasn't pitching an idea. He was about to prove it worked. And in doing so, set off an investigation that would eventually stretch across borders, agencies, and continents. In the spring of 2004, a brand-new Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce branch prepared for its grand opening in suburban Winnipeg. Construction crews finished drywall. Painters rolled fresh beige onto the walls. IT technicians calibrated a row of 7 brand-new ATMs. 3 nights before opening day, Gerald Blanchard slipped inside. He picked the service door lock quietly, wearing black gloves and soft-soled shoes, and stepped into the unfinished branch. He didn't steal a single dollar. Not yet. Instead, Gerald installed a surveillance network. A wireless pinhole camera, no larger than a shirt button, went behind a ceiling vent directly above the branch manager's desk. A $40 baby monitor transmitter, the kind sold at any Walmart, disappeared behind an electrical outlet near the alarm control panel. A voice-activated audio bug from a mail-order spy catalog adhered beneath the customer service counter. Each device was tested with a handheld receiver. Each signal came through clean. Gerald exited the way he entered, relocking the door behind him. For the next 2 weeks, he listened. He parked a rented van within receiver range, sometimes in a grocery store lot, sometimes on a quiet residential street, and documented everything. The security guard's patrol route, 12-minute loops, always the same direction. The cleaning crew's schedule, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 9 to 11 p.m. 2 women who never checked the server closet. Camera blind spots, a 6-foot corridor near the fire exit, a wedge of shadow beside the ATM room door. Most importantly, he watched the branch manager. Every morning, she punched the alarm code into the keypad. 6 digits. Gerald captured the motion on his ceiling camera and memorized the sequence. One night at 3:15 a.m., he ran a test. He nudged the service door just enough to trip the magnetic sensor, then retreated to his van and listened. 2 Winnipeg police cruisers arrived in exactly 8 minutes. Officers circled the building with flashlights, checked the doors, found no signs of forced entry, and radioed dispatch. False alarm. Premises secure. They were gone in under 4 minutes. Gerald wrote in his notebook, 8-minute window minimum. On May 15, 2004, one night before the branch's public grand opening, Gerald returned. 12:04 a.m. His girlfriend, Angela, waited down the block in a sedan, scanning the street with an encrypted walkie-talkie in her lap. Gerald jimmied the side door he had pre-loosened weeks earlier and stepped into the dark lobby. The alarm keypad glowed red. He entered the 6-digit code. The light blinked green. Silence. The vault would take too long. Too noisy. His real target was the ATM room. 7 machines stood in a row behind a glass door, each loaded with roughly $100,000 in banded 20s and 50s for Monday's opening. The door was unlocked. A Friday afternoon oversight by an employee rushing home for the weekend. Gerald had rehearsed this moment in his garage. He had built a full-scale ATM replica using a decommissioned machine bought at auction. He knew exactly where to insert the pry tool, exactly how much pressure to apply. He worked quickly. 4 minutes in, 3 machines were empty. 6 minutes in, 6 machines were down. He deliberately left the 7th ATM untouched. A false clue, meant to suggest interruption or incomplete knowledge. At 7 minutes, Gerald zipped the canvas duffel. Roughly $750,000 in cash. He exited through the side door, relocked it with his pick set, and slid into a waiting Dodge Caravan. No screeching tires. No headlights. Angela followed a block behind. 8 minutes and 14 seconds after Gerald entered the bank, 2 Winnipeg police cruisers roared into the parking lot. Lights flashing. Officers jumped out, checked the doors, peered through intact windows. Everything looked normal. They radioed dispatch. False alarm. Premises secure. 3 blocks away, Gerald pulled into an alley and shut off the engine. He listened. Through the baby monitor still transmitting from the ceiling vent, he heard officers confirm the all-clear. Only then did he allow himself a grin. The police had just guarded a crime scene, without knowing a crime had even occurred. By the time the Winnipeg ATM heist unfolded, Gerald Blanchard had fully embraced the philosophy he had been developing for years. Banks were no longer physical fortresses. They were puzzles, predictable systems with weaknesses built from human assumptions. Vaults? Time-locked schedules. Alarms? Circuit logic. Cameras? Fixed angles with predictable blind spots. The only real variable? People. The guards, managers, and especially police. Their reactions, their routines, their blind spots controlled the outcome. And Gerald controlled them. Over the following month, as investigators scrambled for answers, Gerald didn't hide. He observed. Through his ceiling bugs, he listened to detectives speculate. He heard them puzzle over missing cash, pried ATM faces, and absent footage. He heard a detective mutter, frustrated, "How the hell did this ghost know our response times?" He chuckled softly. The police had unwittingly become players in his game, moving exactly as he predicted. Every assumption they made became a vulnerability. Gerald didn't stop at observation. He actively manipulated their perceptions. Using prepaid burner phones and a disguised voice, he called the lead investigator pretending to be a nervous witness. He hinted that the ATM serviceman might have copied the master keys. He called the regional security office, suggesting inside involvement. Each call sent investigators down false trails. Each diversion bought him more breathing room. Weeks passed. The city's major crimes unit chased phantoms while Gerald refined his methods. He logged every looped schedule, every predictable patrol, every pattern that could be exploited. Timing became precise to the second. Every false alarm was a rehearsal. Every overlooked security flaw was a window into the future. By now, he wasn't just a thief. He was a strategist, a systems analyst, a psychological manipulator. His reputation didn't need newspapers or police reports. It existed in the gaps he created, the assumptions he exploited, and the law enforcement officers who realized too late that they were playing by his rules. And yet, as brilliant as he was, Gerald remained human. Even a master of systems could slip. One small oversight, an almost laughably mundane mistake, would eventually undo him. But until that moment, he had turned entire police departments into unwitting collaborators in his heists, orchestrating chaos with nothing more than patience, observation, and a profound understanding of human error. By the time Gerald Blanchard returned to Canada after the Winnipeg ATM heist, banks had become almost routine. He craved a challenge that demanded every skill he possessed, something that would etch his name into criminal legend. Years before the Winnipeg job, during a backpacking trip through Central Europe, Gerald had found it, the CC star. A 10-pointed hair ornament crafted in 1864 by Viennese court jeweler Kukert, once worn by Empress Elizabeth of Austria. 27 diamonds radiating outward from a Baroque pearl at its center. A symbol of imperial romance and tragedy. Protected under glass in Vienna's Schönbrunn Palace, a sprawling 1,441-room fortress. Monitored by motion sensors, pressure plates, infrared beams, and armed guards. Exactly the kind of challenge Gerald couldn't resist. Posing as a wealthy Canadian tourist, he booked a private tour of the palace's treasure room. While the guide recited history, Gerald memorized camera positions, sweep patterns of motion sensors, and, most importantly, a side gallery window with a simple brass latch, no electronic sensor. He lingered, pretending to admire a tapestry, and discreetly flipped the latch open. On the following night, Gerald boarded a rented Cessna 172, climbing to 4,000 feet above Vienna's western suburbs. Parachute strapped to his back, goggles over his eyes, adrenaline coursing. The pilot banked over Glorad Hilltop, signaled, and Gerald opened the door. He jumped. The wind roared. He slammed onto the sloped palace roof, skidded, and nearly fell 4 stories. For 3 heart-stopping seconds, he dangled above a cobblestone courtyard, fingers clawing at the gutter. Then he hauled himself onto the shingles, bundled the chute behind a chimney, creeped along the roofline to the window he had unlatched. Inside, the treasure room glowed under dim emergency lighting. Display cases cast long shadows. The CC star rested under a glass dome on a velvet pedestal. Gerald approached carefully. Withdrawn from his belt pouch, a jeweler's screwdriver. 4 screws loosened, dome lifted. He palmed a plastic replica in his left hand. Pinched the real star's mounting pin with his right. Executed the swap in a single fluid motion. The weight sensor blinked red, then green. No alarm sounded. Seconds later, the glass dome resealed. He retraced his path, rappelled down a drainage pipe into the gardens, and sprinted toward a service gate he had previously scouted. By dawn, Gerald was aboard a train to Munich. the real CC star, wrapped in a T-shirt at the bottom of a scuba gear duffel. 2 weeks later, Austrian officials unveiled the exhibit publicly, unaware that the piece under glass was a $20 gift shop replica. By the time the switch was discovered, the genuine artifact rested safely in Gerald Blanchard's grandmother's basement in Winnipeg. He had parachuted onto a palace roof, bypassed every security system, and walked out undetected. If anyone doubted his abilities before, there was no question now. Gerald had become a legend. Back in Canada, investigators connecting the 2004 Winnipeg ATM heist to Gerald Blanchard stumbled onto an old Interpol file, the CC star. The ATM phantom and the palace ghost were the same man. By now, Gerald had vanished, rotating aliases, changing addresses, and leaving no trace of his presence. He had become the ghost the authorities could never touch. But in 2006, 2 veteran Winnipeg detectives convinced their department to fund a covert operation, Project Kite. 4 months, the task force wiretapped every phone number, tracked every safe house, and monitored every suspected associate. Maps, photographs, post-it notes covered their office walls. Aliases, suspected scores, locations, everything they could find. In late January 2007, their patience paid off. An intercepted phone call cracked the case open. Gerald's voice, barely above a whisper, "I can't talk now. I'm in the middle of something." He was crawling through the ductwork of a credit union in Chilliwack, British Columbia, preparing for another midnight burglary. The task force triangulated the signal in real time. SWAT teams mobilized across 3 provinces. January 23, 2007, 4:30 a.m. In Vancouver, a dozen officers breached Gerald's condo. Flashbang grenades detonated. Rifles raised. Black-clad operators flooded inside. Gerald lunged toward a window and found a wall of gun barrels. No ceiling tiles to lift. No vent to crawl through. The ghost was cornered. Simultaneously, officers raided storage lockers and homes of associates. They recovered high-powered laptops, lockpicking kits, stacks of fake IDs, cash in 6 currencies, wigs, disguises, police scanners, and even unopened baby monitors. In Winnipeg, the CC star itself was recovered from a crawl space in his grandmother's basement. 9 years after the theft, the legendary jewel was finally back in official hands. For the first time, the man who had outsmarted law enforcement across continents faced the consequences. Yet even then, Gerald still held power over those who thought they had cornered him. Knowledge of police routines, personal lives, and private habits gave him a psychological edge that would leave interrogators unsettled. The cracks had appeared, but the game of control and manipulation wasn't over. 2 lead detectives from Project Kite sat across from Gerald Blanchard in a windowless Winnipeg interrogation room. Thick folders of evidence lay between them: photographs, phone transcripts, recovered loot inventories. They expected silence, defiance, perhaps a demand for a lawyer. Gerald offered none of it. He leaned back calmly, almost casually, and began to speak. "How's Karen doing these days?" "Still teaching 3rd grade at Balmoral Hall." The senior detective froze. Karen was his wife. Balmoral Hall was her school. Neither detail appeared in any case file. Gerald turned to the second officer. "And your son James, he made the Bantam hockey team this year, didn't he? Left wing, right?" The detectives' faces drained. Neither had disclosed family names. Neither had shared routines. Yet Gerald knew. 4 months, he had monitored unencrypted police radio chatter. He had listened to personal calls from parked cruisers. He had picked up careless conversations in coffee shop lots within scanner range. In that moment, the power dynamic flipped. The interrogators became the interrogated. The tables had turned. Bravado aside, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Surveillance footage from the Chilliwack Credit Union. Fingerprints from his garage ATM replica. The recovered CC Star. A storage locker inventory resembling a spy movie prop list. Gerald faced 164 years across multiple counts: theft, fraud, conspiracy, and international trafficking of stolen cultural property. But instead of defiance, he chose cooperation. Over weeks of debriefings, Gerald meticulously explained every technique he had ever developed. Cloning alarm signals using modified baby monitors. Eavesdropping on dispatch frequencies with off-the-shelf scanners. Constructing full-scale target replicas for rehearsal. Timing police responses down to the second using staged false alarms. One veteran detective admitted, shaking his head, "Never in my career has a suspect explained in such detail how he beat us." Gerald even led officers to the crawlspace where the CC Star had waited nearly a decade. He lifted it from its hiding place, handed it over with calm precision. The Austrian authorities arranged for its return. This time, under significantly upgraded security. Even facing decades in prison, Gerald retained one final element of control: the respect, fear, and fascination of the very system he had outwitted. Gerald Blanchard's court proceedings concluded with a guilty plea on multiple counts. Prosecutors requested the maximum. The judge sentenced him to 8 years, a fraction of the theoretical ceiling, reflecting his cooperation and, perhaps, grudging respect for the audacity of his crimes. True to his personal code, Gerald refused to name a single accomplice. Every getaway driver, lookout, or fence walked free. He served roughly 4 years before earning parole. By 2010, the man who had outsmarted police and banks alike found himself in a new role: security consultant. Banks paid him to audit alarm systems. Police departments brought him in to train staff on vulnerabilities he had once exploited. He tested networks, advised on radio encryption, and coached teams to think like the criminals hunting them. In effect, Gerald became a fox hired to redesign the henhouse. Across Canada, changes followed his blueprint. Unencrypted tactical police frequencies were phased out. ATM protocols were upgraded. Redundant weight sensors and random scheduling became standard. Institutions evolved because of Gerald Blanchard. He hadn't just stolen, they had been forced to improve. Years later, Gerald reflected on his journey. "When you're a kid, everyone dreams of robbing a bank. I actually did it." The press dubbed him the world's most ingenious thief. He had proven that every system built by humans contains human assumptions, and assumptions can be exploited by anyone patient enough to find them. Ironically, he only got caught because a maintenance worker scribbled a license plate on a napkin. Without that tiny slip, Project Kite might have chased a ghost forever. Tonight, somewhere, someone else may be scanning police frequencies, mapping a response window, and planning the next impossible heist. The game of cat and mouse never truly ends. It only moves to new frequencies. And that, in essence, is the invisible hand Gerald Blanchard pulled, forcing every institution to evolve simply by understanding the human assumption behind the system.